We're going to get started here, and welcome to the James P. 60 and Mary C. Sczepaniak Lecture Series Spring Dinner. Loyola University's History Department began an annual spring dinner in 2013 as a way to bring alumni, students, colleagues, friends, and general history buffs to campus to share in an evening a good conversation on historic topics. In spring 2014, the history faculty had the pleasure of meeting Jim and Fran Sczepaniak when they joined us for our second annual dinner lecture. Before he died, in 1914, Mr. Sczepaniak's love of history prompted him to include in his will. Does it hear me? No. Hello? Shut up. I don't know what happened. Anyway, I'll use my teacher voice to include the history department in his will, and he generously gave us an endowment so we can continue to bring speakers here and share our love of history with all of you. So the history department is very grateful for his generosity, so we can continue to make this a tradition. We are delighted to welcome all of you, and we are especially excited to welcome Romeoville High School AP history students for an evening's talk on how the Mexican border became a problem, Pancho Villa and Beyond. Our speaker this evening is Dr. Ben Johnson of Loyola University's History Department. Dr. Johnson's primary area of research and teaching include North American borders, Latino history, environmental history. He has taught courses on North American and world environmental history, natural disasters, immigration and ethnicity in the United States, and border and transnational history. He has also published books called Revolution in Texas, How a Forgotten Rebellion and Its Bloody Suppression Turned Mexicans into Americans, Border Town, The Odyssey of an American Place, and Bridging National Borders in North America. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ben Johnson.
Let's see, is this working again? I'm not always smart, but I'm loud, so even if this kicks off, we'll be okay. So I was just sitting here with like 12 people. I'm fine, I got this covered, and I go out to the bathroom and I come back in, and now there's all of you, and all of a sudden I'm nervous. So you have me badly outnumbered, but it's a real pleasure to be here, and thanks for coming. And thanks for coming out. You know, I first started studying the U.S.-Mexican border in the 1990s for a number of reasons, including trying to understand my own conflicted feelings, having grown up in Texas and witnessing some of the changes and some of the debates that have now seized the nation as a whole. And unfortunately, I'm old enough to remember when NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, was passed and came into effect in 1994. But one of the reasons, honestly, I started I was drawn to history. I wanted to become an American historian and become a college professor. One of the reasons I was drawn to border topics was my sense that they were becoming so important to the United States, but they were so relatively understudied, and that people weren't paying that much attention to it. And I was always intimidated by topics like slavery, the Civil War, immigration, that great minds had studied for generations. And I thought I was like a good student and had a strong work ethic, but I was definitely not a great mind. So I thought I could go off into a little corner of the profession where I would be one of the few people, and people would never pay that much attention to the topic that I was studying. Now you study borders, and I don't have that luxury, right? I've been exposed. And the gratifying thing, more seriously, is that people actually pay much more attention to the sort of things that we study. And it's the danger, I think, is that, and I hope that the study of the past somehow informs the future, right? And to my mind, the fact that the United States shares this long and porous border with the rest of the Western Hemisphere has just come to be one of the defining characteristics of the United States. And if you want to explain what life is like in America in the 20th century on, you couldn't do so without reference to the border. At the same time, I think in a way it's poorly understood, And at least my experience is that my students and even my peers don't have the kind of stories about the history of the border that they do about other great topics in United States history. You know, it's mostly a story of division and discord with signs like this. When I lived in California for a year, I was incredibly disturbed to drive down the highway and see a sign like this. You know, we have these things that used to be called meta-narratives, right? These big stories about American history that we would tell. So the rebirth of self-government, of Republican democracy is captured in this classic image. The story of immigration, which obviously touches on the question of the border, but the border was drawn across Native and Mexican communities. It's not entirely a story of immigration. The story of slavery, which when I talked about in my afternoon lecture, actually intersected in surprising and interesting ways with the early history of the border. Mexico was a place of major refuge for slaves living in the western part of the United States South. Questions of national union and the Civil War. Questions of Western expansion, also touching on the border, but not really fully capturing it. Questions of industrialization and urbanization. Nowadays, when we say the border, it's shorthand. We obviously mean our border with Mexico. We do have another border with a country called Canada that a number of you may have heard of and may even have been to. Americans think that we know a lot about our southern border. We suppose or assume that it divides two fundamentally different countries. One mestizo, the other, until at least recently, overwhelmingly European in ancestry. One poor, the other the world's richest nation. One a weak and fragmented policy, supposedly, the other the world's only superpower. This gulf creates problems that are the source of all sorts of public discord. Now more than ever, Mexicans try to cross the line in search of work. Americans presumably don't want them to. Some try to bring drugs here. We want to keep them out. Apparently nobody in the United States actually wants drugs, although people who bring them here still find plenty of ready customers. The border is, as one writer put it classically, una herida abierta, an open wound where the third world grates against the first and bleeds. Today I'd like to argue that the way we reflexively think of the US-Mexican border as a highly policed line that is assumed to divide two very different countries and is radically different than the Canadian border is actually the product of the Mexican Revolution in the 19-teens. In other words, like so much of what we take for granted, the border has a history. It was not always the way it is now. It probably won't always be the way that it is now. In fact, the latest report from the excellent demographic study group, the Pew Foundation, shows over the last decade a strong decline in migration from Mexico due to decreased family size and increased economic prosperity in Mexico. The same thing that happened in the European countries that 120 years ago were the largest sources of immigrants to the United States. So tonight, in graphic terms, what I want to do is describe basically how we get from the picture on the left side of this, right, that is a border that existed but was not patrolled, was openly crossed, it's just like crossing a big street, to the border more of today, right, that has a wall, that has checkpoints, that's fraught, that's dangerous, that is controversial. I need, there we go, yeah, there's plenty of room up here. No, it's okay. To make this point, I need to first go back before the Mexican Revolution and into the 19th century. It's certainly true that the border was born in violence. Mexico had never accepted the independence of Texas, which was gained in 1836, and the war that followed Texas's 1845 annexation to the United States cost Mexico its northern expanse, and had some enthusiastic Anglo-Americans had their way, would have cost Mexico even more of her territory. By the mid-19th century, the United States was an empire. It had wrested its territory from other peoples by force of arms and subjected conquered peoples, Indians and Mexicans, to its rule. Americans have perpetually forgotten this fact, though Mexicans have not. Nevertheless, the border brought Americans and Mexicans together in unexpected ways. All three of the nation states of North America, Mexico, Canada, and the United States, were keen on marking their territory. as we see in these two images, the first from the northern plains and the second from the Sonoran Desert. This was the spatial aspect of their very similar ambitions to build republics in the New World. The boundary lines between them were supposed to mark where one sovereign state's territory ended and another's began. But somebody forgot to tell this to other polities, namely Indian peoples, particularly the Comanche and Apache peoples, whose territory and military might straddled the new international border. In the negotiations leading up to the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, right, which settled the U.S.-Mexican War and created the modern U.S. Southwest, the Mexican negotiators shrewdly insisted that the U.S. take on the obligation of halting Indian raids and movement across the border. The overly confident American delegation agreed, not realizing what a task this would be. Within a few years, they were asking Mexico for a release from this commitment. And so this is an image from the 1820s of one of the foremost equestrian people of the Great Plains, whose military might stretch deep into both the American Great Plains and Mexico. Some older maps give you a huge extent of the scope of Apache and Comanche military power, which involved a domain larger than the territory of most nations on the planet at that time. It's a mark of Comanche territory and Comanche raids, and look how incredibly far down they go into Mexico. This, of course, is Geronimo. The Indian Wars in the borderlands lasted until the 1880s, almost 2 generations, ending with the final military defeat of the Apache and their confinement onto reservations. In these wars, the United States and Mexico were allies, not antagonists. They had a common interest in creating a border that was a border between them and not involving any other polities or people. Mexican authorities in Sonora provided invaluable supplies and logistical support to the U.S. cavalry's campaigns against Geronimo's bands. Mexico formally agreed to allow U.S. military forces to operate on its soil, a remarkable fact given the divisive war between the two just decades before. The duration of this Indian fighting also had parallel cultural effects in the Mexican North and the U.S. West, a topic that I can only briefly touch on here. Many northern Mexicans thought of themselves in much the same way as the sort of Western mythos of the United States encourages Americans to think of themselves. And I'm a survivor of Saturday morning Westerns. I lived with my mom during the week, and we were bohemian and had no television. And I went to my dad's on the weekend and sat in front of the television for 72 hours straight. So it was Westerns. It was Westerns all day. And when I started reading about northern Mexico, after the defeat of the Apache, I'm like, these guys are like me, right? These guys are like the Texans. They thought of themselves as pioneers, as independent people who had wrested their homes from savages by force of arms and had thus earned their land, economic independence, and political rights by their frontier service to Mexico. Pictured here are Eduardo Gabilondo and John Slaughter, together with their wives. One of these is a prominent family in the settlement of the Arizona Territory, and the other in the settlement of Sonora. Can you tell who is a Mexican family and who is an American family? I can't. I have the answer, but I won't tell it to you. These men both thought of themselves as Apache fighters, as regional entrepreneurs and cattlemen, and for decades they cooperated in the conquest and incorporation of the Arizona-Sonora borderlands. They socialized together, they drank together, they traded cattle and livestock together. Their children married one another. These were a people who had far more in common than they had that divided them. It was not just Indian fighting that brought the governing classes of the United States and Mexico together around their shared border. Several regional rebellions did as well, and there are Canadian counterparts to this as well that I won't touch on. In 1859, Juan Cortina led an armed force into Brownsville, Texas, at the very southern tip of Texas, in protest of the treatment of Mexicans and Mexican Americans in Texas, their denial of rights in the criminal justice system, the theft of their land, which was formally guaranteed to them under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. His small army captured the city jail, releasing those whom he felt had been unfairly imprisoned, and executed 4 Anglos who had gone unpunished despite their murders of Mexican Americans. The next 6 months of warfare laid waste to a strip of nearly 120 miles on the U.S. border. And Cortina is a fascinating figure. He considered him, it's not clear whether he considered himself to be Mexican or American. He was born in the United States. He had citizenship rights. He voted. He had held office. He had family members who were in office. But he also considered himself the proud bearer of Mexican culture. And basically both the Mexican and the U.S. governments saw this happening and were like, we have to get rid of this guy, right? This is not something we're going to tolerate. The U.S. Army was dispatched under a colonel with the name of Robert E. Lee, who had just finished suppressing John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. Elements of the Mexican military were mobilized. And Mexican and U.S. forces worked together to defeat Cortina, just as they had against the Apache. He survived for decades more as a major political and military figure in the Mexican Northeast. He ran guns to Union partisans in Texas during the U.S. Civil War and fought on the side of Benito Juarez in the civic conflicts in Mexico in the 1860s. It was a commitment to incarcerate Juan Cortina that earned a general named Porfirio Diaz the financial backing of wealthy Texans. And it was the jailing of the Texas rebel Cortina that was one of Diaz's first actions when he assumed national power in Mexico in 1886. He would rule Mexico until the revolution in 1910 in what became the Western Hemisphere's oldest regime. It was under Diaz's regime that we see another important way in which the border tied the United States and Mexico together rather than dividing them. His administration enthusiastically welcomed foreign investment, more and more of which was American. Under the Diaz regime, called the Porfiriato, foreign capital played an indispensable role in creating the nation's railroad system. And here you see the U.S. railroad system beginning to plug into Mexico, first through Juarez and El Paso and the western tip of Texas, then in Nogales, Sonora, and Arizona, and eventually through Laredo, Texas. And then here you have a map that captures over time the expansion of the Mexican railroad system. So the dark red is the earliest stuff, or the solid red is the earliest stuff, then the solid green. And if you notice, especially the early railroad system funnels right up to the United States, right? It's a lot easier to move up through Mexico towards the U.S. and to interface with the U.S. network than it is to move across Mexico, and that's no accident. Modern mining and smelting came to Mexico and to the border in this period as well. So here's a major site of copper production and smelting in Cananea, Sonora, with the inside of a plant and 2 American workers here. And then the major site of smelting, the Asarco smokestacks, which stood until recently as major landmarks in El Paso, Texas. This investment profoundly changed Mexico. Indeed, more and more Mexicans came to believe that there was too much money coming in from the outside, buying up their lands, driving up prices for food and shelter, and making them paupers in their own country. But it also changed the United States. Whether they knew it or not, when Americans sent a telegraph to England or called one another on the phone, and here on the left you see the wonderful phone system in New York before it became rationalized. When Americans did those things, they relied on the copper whose extraction was made possible by the ties forged across the border. Just as when today we eat guacamole on Super Bowl Sunday or drive cars powered by Mexican oil, we unknowingly pay homage to our trans-border economy. The world made by the elites of both countries was blown apart by the Mexican Revolution. What was good for wealthy Mexicans and foreigners was not so good necessarily for the Mexican people, nearly 2/3 of whom were landless peasant families by 1910. And some of my favorite pictures of Porfirio Diaz this is his younger career as a patriotic general fighting for the independence of Mexico, particularly against French intervention. And here he is both younger, and he also looks like a Latin American person. Near the end of his life, and here he is in the final rule of his regime, he has not only reached a sort of more portly middle-aged status, and is festooned by self-congratulatory medals that he has awarded himself for his service to the country, but he also looks literally whiter, and in fact Diaz put on powder to make himself look less Latin and more European or more white, and that was for many a symbol of what the Diaz regime had become. Here's a mural after the Mexican Revolution meant to depict him in the middle with his general looking over the shoulder, someone who would go on to assassinate his political opponents, and then he's being entreated on his right, our left, by an American capitalist, right, in a top hat. In 1910, Diaz faced the most serious challenge to his re-election in the form of Francisco Madero, the scion of one of the North's wealthiest families. Madero called for free elections, independent courts, and an uncensored press, and came from a very prominent family. You can think of him as a kind of a Roosevelt or a Kennedy, right? Very wealthy and well-connected, liberal, not radical, but liberal in his outlook, believing in the rule of law, orderly elections, and the like. Madero complained about the extent of foreign domination of the economy. Massive fraud and violence by the Diaz regime sent him fleeing to San Antonio, Texas, where he declared himself the provisional president of Mexico and called for the armed overthrow of Diaz. He had no soldiers of his own, but a series of revolts led most prominently by Emiliano Zapata in the south of Mexico, which is actually already underway when Madero waged his campaign, and Francisco Pancho Villa in the north, erupted by the spring of 1911. The rebels took took the city of Juarez across from El Paso, capturing the most important railroad junction, and Diaz decided he didn't have the heart to fight and left and shipped off for France, where he died a few years later. Provisional elections were held again, this time openly and fairly. Madero was overwhelmingly elected president of Mexico. What might have been an orderly transition in power and a return to electoral democracy came quickly undone. And Madero really hoped that Mexico would become a country like the United States, characterized by the rule of law, by orderly political processes, and by the resolution of disputes through the courts and through elections rather than through resort to arms. The key constituents of Diaz's old regime, regional political bosses, wealthy landowners, elements of the Catholic Church, and industrialists and the Federal Army never accepted Madero's rule, believing him perilously weak and unable to prevent the lower orders from asserting themselves. In 1913, the commander of the Federal Army assassinated Madero and much of his family and dismissed the Congress. His forces desperately fought to undo the revolution. Venustiano Carranza, another wealthy northern Mexican and a personal friend and a family friend of Francisco Madero's, sort of took up Madero's mantle and sought to restore his liberal and moderate rule, whereas others like Villa and Zapata fought for a more radical vision of land reform, felt that there needed to be a more thoroughgoing revolution and one that involved the redistribution of property, not just setting up formal electoral mechanisms. A plethora of local rebellions and alliances, many unconnected to larger factions or ideologies, also emerged by the end of 1913. Revolutionary armies, most importantly Villa's army, destroyed the old Federal Army within several years and decisively prevented a return of something like the Diaz regime. And then they fought among themselves for control of the country for the rest of the decade. So basically Mexico is racked by warfare from 1911 to 1920. By the early 20s, the central government, under the leadership of one of Carranza's former generals, had asserted control over much of the nation, defeating and ultimately assassinating Villa and Zapata. The post-revolutionary regime enjoyed much broader support than Porfirio Diaz had, and for the next few decades would launch programs of mass education, infrastructure construction, economic development, and land redistribution that would substantially improve the lives of most Mexican citizens as measured by things like life expectancy, rates of infant mortality, rates of literacy, especially for women and girls. And we've now reached the point actually where life expectancy in Mexico is just about a year or a year and a half less than it is in the United States. I think if you just paid attention to the images that came across American television or your Facebook feed, you might think of modern Mexico as a failed state. Quite to the contrary, I think the history of Mexico since the revolution is one of the great success stories of economic and social progress in the modern world. And indeed, the Mexican Revolution was the first great social revolution of the 20th century, to be followed in turn by revolts in Russia, Ireland, Iran, or elsewhere. In terms of the border and in terms of U.S. history, The first and in some ways most fundamental aspect of the revolution was that it dramatically increased south to north migrations. Over the course of the 19 teens, so that one decade where of the revolution, perhaps as many as 1 in 10 Mexican citizens, some 1.5 million people, fled Mexico for the United States. About another tenth of the population died in Mexico. So this is an incredibly traumatic decade for Mexico. Those migrants dramatically transformed the culture and demography of the borderlands and beyond. The Mexican descent population of the United States tripled between 1910 and 1920, most visibly in places like Los Angeles, which would go on to have the largest Mexican descent population of any city in the world, except for Mexico City, but also noticeably in places like Chicago, Detroit, and ultimately throughout the country. And so that set into motion a pattern of migration that has lasted until today, right? It sort of went into hiatus during the decade of the Great Depression, but it's lasted until today. And it was really only in this decade then that Americans began to associate the Mexican border with Mexican migration. Beforehand, it was the Chinese immigrants, mostly banned by the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, who were the major preoccupation. And here's a pretty ghastly depiction from the famous Western artist Frederick Remington of a Chinese man dying in the desert, which to me evokes the images of migrant suffering today. And indeed, the Chinese migrants are arguably the people who were the first illegal aliens in U.S. law, in the sense of people who were banned by law from being present, but who nonetheless felt that they had a reason to come here. The derogatory term wetback was first applied to Chinese immigrants in other parts of the country, like French Canadians in New England, were referred to as the Chinese of New England. So in some ways, if you're in 1910, if you're thinking about the prototypical sort of problematic migrant, that would have been associated more with the Chinese than with anybody else. And the first border patrol were the Chinese inspectors of the U.S. Treasury Department, whose job was to go around catching Chinese people and kicking them out of the country or keeping them from coming into the country. So it's only in the 1910s that Americans start to worry about Mexicans actually coming into the country. Indeed, as late as the 19 teens, Chinese people who were trying to enter the United States would move to Mexico, dress up like a working class Mexican, learn a few words of Spanish, and say "Hola, ¿qué tal?" to the border officer, who would like wave them in, which is not a way of crossing into the United States that I recommend to anybody trying to come into the country today. The second aspect of the revolution that I want to stress is that it inspired a similar effort on U.S. soil. This was in South Texas, which along with Southern California and northern New Mexico was the part of the United States with the largest Mexican descent population, right, that had been incorporated into the United States not because they moved, but because the borders moved across them. And this is a little known episode. It was the subject of my first book, which I've tried to painfully distill 212 pages into 3 pages tonight. This revolt began in deep South Texas in the summer of 1915 as a series of raids on ranches, irrigation works, and railroads by Mexican Americans, and quickly developed into a full-blown rebellion. Groups of armed men, and I'll apologize for the low quality of some of these images. They're just, they're bad images in reality, and they are even worse when they get blown up into large scale. Groups of armed men, up to 100 in size, stole livestock, burned railroad bridges, derailed a train. This is the only train link out of the city of Brownsville, tore up tracks, killed farmers, attacked post offices, robbed stores, and repeatedly battled local posses, Texas Rangers, and the thousands of federal soldiers dispatched to quell this violence. The raids appeared to be the manifesto, the fulfillment of a manifesto entitled the Plan de San Diego, named after a small town in South Texas, drafted in early 1915, right in the middle of the Mexican Revolution, after the armies of Villa and Zapata have destroyed Diaz's old army, and it's clear that there's going to be a new day in Mexico. The plan, which was modeled after other proclamations of the revolution, called for a liberating army of all races composed of Mexicans, African Americans, and Indians to overthrow United States rule in Texas, Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. In other words, to undo the U.S.-Mexican War, right, of 1846, 1848. The freed territory would form an independent nation, perhaps to rejoin Mexico at a future date. And this is one of the leaders of this, a man in South Texas, Luis de la Rosa. This effort was clearly inspired by the Mexican Revolution. Here we have the flag that was taken from them. I don't think you can necessarily read the writing, but it says, Ejército Libertador de los Mexicotejanos, Liberating Army of the Texas Mexicans, and it has the symbol, the old Aztec symbol of the eagle on the cactus with the snake in its mouth. The first major land redistribution in Mexico's north took place in 1913, shortly across the river from Brownsville after revolutionary factions dislodged the old federal army. If Mexicans in Mexico forced off their land by what they saw as the machinations of the wealthy and politically powerful could find successful redress through armed revolution, then why couldn't the same thing be done by Mexicans in Texas who were similarly being swindled out of their lands and deprived of their birthrights? For a brief time, the rebellion did make significant headway in South Texas. This is one of the largest instances of civil unrest and mass violence in U.S. history, but very little known. I've argued it's larger in scale than the New York City draft riots, for example, in the middle of the Civil War, which are often invoked as the largest civil disturbance in U.S. history. This rebellion did make significant headway in South Texas. Aided by a revolutionary commander in northeastern Mexico, rebels from Mexican-American families who had recently lost their land to Anglo-Americans made a local revolution. But this revolt was a terrible miscalculation. In response, vigilantes and Texas Rangers led a far bloodier counterinsurgency that included the indiscriminate harassment of all people of Mexican descent, the forcible relocation of rural residents, and mass executions, what we might call ethnic cleansing if it happened today. And indeed, when I was doing this research, it was in the 1990s, I would wake up and listen to the news, and it was about Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia becoming undone, and ethnic conflict in Yugoslavia. And I would go down into the archives and read microfilm, and it was like reading about the same thing having happened, 80 years before in my own country. So here's an image of skeletons having been left to rot in the Chaparral. Here is something that was actually circulated as a postcard in the grisly way that lynching images often were in the U.S. South, and that provoked great outrage across the Southwest and across Mexico. This is one of the most prominent victims of this vigilante violence, Antonio Longoria, whose gravesite, who was buried by a sympathetic Anglo neighbor after he was shot off his horse by Texas Rangers, and whose his family is still there. They actively maintain this gravesite, which is just on the side of a small rural road. And it became so bad that Mexican Americans in South Texas in the fall of 1915 actually started packing up and fleeing into Mexico, right, in the reverse of that huge pattern of migration out of Mexico. And if you were running for your life and going to Mexico, you were definitely had been a person who was terrorized. This violence grew to include mass executions. Bodies from mass executions nearby remained in the open for months. I saw the bones of about 5 or 6 months afterwards. The skeletons, remembered one farmer. A prominent politician recalled coming across decomposing bodies after he saw buzzards circling overhead and smelled a foul odor. For years afterwards, residents found corpses in the brush with skulls marked by execution-style bullet holes. One day's dispatch from a New York City newspaper typified the vigilantism at its height in the fall of 1915. The bodies of 3 of the 20 or more Mexicans that were locked up overnight in the small frame jail at San Benito were found lying beside the road. Here I'm quoting. All 3 of the men had been shot in the back. Near Edinburgh, the bodies of 2 more were found. They had been slain during the night. During the morning, the decapitated body of another, tied to a large log, floated down the Rio Grande. Such killings were so common that a San Antonio reporter observed that, quote, finding of dead bodies of Mexicans has reached a point where it creates little or no interest. These killings were not surreptitious affairs, but rather openly called for and boasted about. The Laredo Times, for example, seemed to call for genocide when it declared that, quote, the recent happenings in Brownsville country indicate there is a serious surplus population there that needs elimination. Much of this violence was done by vigilantes. Much of it was also done by the Texas Rangers, so it had the the aura of state authority and therefore of legitimacy about it, right? It wasn't just random vigilantes. This is organized and prosecuted by the state of Texas. Interestingly, not the U.S. Army, and actually a lot of communities started inviting the U.S. Army in. And I don't have too much time to get into this, but at various points, Army commanders threatened to put Texas Rangers under arrest, and at one point threatened the governor of Texas with putting the southern tip of Texas under martial law, not so much to control the revolt, which they felt was under control, but actually to control the vigilantism that it had unleashed. South Texas's new Anglo-agricultural elite used the uprising as a pretext to expel and sometimes kill Mexican-American landowners and to impose a thoroughgoing racial segregation on a region where Mexican descent people still enjoyed political rights and in many cases high social standing, served in offices and including in like local constabularies and police forces, right, carrying, wearing a badge and carrying a gun, but most of that was taken away from them in the aftermath of the uprising. I hope this doesn't sound like a shameless plug. If you're interested in more information about this, you can go to refusingtoforget.org. And this last year in Texas, some other scholars and I succeeded in getting the big State Museum of Texas History to actually mount an exhibit about this, which is as close as the state has come to acknowledging its role in this violence. This revolt was decisively crushed by the fall of 1915, but the tumult along the border had not ceased and indeed threatened to become much worse. The Plan of San Diego uprising caused massive tensions, as you might imagine, between the two governments, with people in U.S. President Woodrow Wilson's administration accusing Venustiano Carranza, then in control of more and more of Mexico, of tolerating and perhaps even aiding the revolt. This came to a boil in March of 1916 when Pancho Villa led an early morning attack on Columbus, New Mexico, his famous raid on Columbus. Villa's forces hit a U.S. military encampment and burned much of the town to the ground before departing. While Villa's exact motives for the attack remain unclear, it may have reflected his rejection of the U.S. government's diplomacy towards Mexico. At this point, Villa was starting to lose the war for control of Mexico to Carranza and his forces, whose administration had secured U.S. recognition as the de facto government of Mexico in 1915. So the U.S. government had sort of sided with Carranza by this point. Moreover, Wilson had let Carranza's forces use a U.S. railroad to move key elements of his army from El Paso, Texas to Douglas, Arizona, where they delivered a major blow to Villa in the battle outside of Sonora City. The United States, Villa and many other Mexicans feared, was playing favorites, right? Intervening in the civil conflict in Mexico to put its favored candidate in control of Mexico, someone who was more likely to honor the property rights of American investors and be sympathetic to the United States. Villa's attack was a defeat in military terms. He lost around 150 men, killing less than 20, but it prompted a substantial U.S. military intervention into Mexico, which was perhaps his goal, to upset the balance of power in Mexico and to frame himself as the person who is heroically resisting the United States and Carranza as kind of the lackey of the United States. 6 days after the attack, the U.S. government sent a so-called punitive, that is, punishing expedition under the command of General John Pershing, with orders to eliminate Villa as a... There, Pershing looks a little better in that picture. With orders to eliminate Villa as a military force and to capture him as possible. President Wilson felt that he had little choice, given mounting criticism in the U.S., including calls for a full-scale invasion from senators and prominent investors whose lands and property had been confiscated during the Mexican Revolution. In other words, there are a lot of powerful people in the United States who are like, it hasn't worked out in Mexico, the revolution is bad for us, let's invade the country, take over the country, and run it. Pershing's expedition began with 4,800 men, but soon reached more than 10,000. Here's a picture of the 7th Cavalry leaving Fort Bliss near El Paso. These men were to spend the next 10 months in Mexican territory in their vain pursuit of the rebel leader Villa. And the aside to this is, Pershing would gain sort of worldwide fame a few years later, well, starting the next year with the U.S. involvement in World War I. But arguably his experiences in Mexico were as important a sign of future warfare, invoking as they do the specter of the difficulties that conventional armies face in waging war against irregular opponents in the midst of hostile populations and countries whose traditions and language they don't really know, whether in Vietnam, Iraq, or Afghanistan. It's really hard for me to look at pictures like this and not think about our current military involvements and the ways that those have and have not worked out. And it was, pretty substantial. So he ended up, his forces ended up, pretty deep into Mexico. I assume that Pershing's expedition is much better known than the Plan of San Diego. If this were a class, I would have done a poll and asked people who had heard of the Plan of San Diego and who had heard. Had anyone heard of the Plan of San Diego before tonight? And who had heard of Villa's raid on New Mexico? And the Pershing punitive expedition? Okay, how about the Zimmerman telegram? Oh, ding, 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 or Zimmerman is in the house. Okay, my point now is Villa's attack came close to prompting an outright invasion precisely because of how alarmed U.S. authorities were because of the earlier revolt in Texas, the Plan of San Diego. The correspondence I've examined makes it clear Carranza was desperately afraid that a resumption of the uprisings in Texas would lead to a full U.S. invasion, right, a repeat of 1846. And so he looked at Pershing coming and he said, oh, is this the beginning of the end of an independent Mexico? So ironically, even though they were on the brink of war, the governments of the U.S. and Mexico had reason to cooperate, just as they had done so extensively in the 19th century. And Carranza's government tried to work out a way where it would sort of give the U.S. the right to chase Villa without seeming too accommodationist. And what they went back to was the military agreement in the 1880s against the Apache, under which they had invited American forces in for their own good. So it's not just a historic resonance that we see looking back from the 21st century. It was actually in the minds of Mexicans before. They're like, we need to make this look legitimate and look like a two-way deal, and the Apache wars are our the predecessor for this, the justification for this. But the punitive expedition was basically unacceptable to Carranza as it was to the vast majority of Mexicans. The way they saw it is they had fought to see their country redeemed from corrupt despotism and would not stand by to see it subjected to American rule instead. It was difficult for them to believe Wilson's declarations that the United States had no interest in waging war against Mexico, especially when General Pershing himself was calling for the occupation of their entire nation, and his deputy, George Patton, who would also go on to fame, though in my book he's one of the most detestable American military figures of the 20th century, Patton dismissed their very capacity to govern themselves, helpfully telling newspapers as he went into Mexico with lots of guys with guns, quote, "One must be a fool indeed to think that a people half-savaged and wholly ignorant will ever form a republic. It is a joke. A despot is all they know or all they want." Well, Mexicans who read that thought, this guy is not on our side, right? This is an invasion. We've just fought a revolution to not have to put up with this. The Wilson administration, for its own part, refused to be burned for a second time. Carranza had proved himself incapable of protecting the border, so the American military would have to. When negotiations between the two governments broke down after several months, the prospect of war seemed increasingly likely. The Mexican ambassador deemed the punitive expedition as an invasion of our country by American forces and basically threatened a war if they advanced any further. To make matters worse, leaders of the Plan de San Diego who had fled from Texas into Mexico in the fall of 1915 as their revolt was being crushed, seized this opportunity to reconstitute some of their forces and to mount attacks near Laredo, Texas, so upriver a bit from where they had been operating. In June of 1917, so this is a few months after Villa's raid, a band of 50 soldiers crossed the Rio Grande in hot pursuit, followed by a large machine gun troop. Carranza warned the United States that entrance into Mexico of any more American troops or soldiers will be considered an act of war. People in border towns started to flee in both directions. I mean, everybody thought we're seeing the start of an all-out warfare. And then 4 days later, it got even worse. A U.S. captain in the punitive expedition led a U.S. force into the town of Carizal, Chihuahua, against the warnings of the Mexican military and the orders of Pershing. He and 6 of his soldiers were killed, with dozens more taken prisoner. So this is kind of like the Black Hawk Down, the Mogadishu disaster of the Pershing expedition, a kind of debacle in which large numbers of Americans were killed and taken hostage. Wilson began drafting a declaration of war that emphasized the failures of Mexico to secure its border. Yet he never had to issue the declaration. Carranza's soldiers broke up the bands of Texas rebels operating on their soil. Local U.S. military commanders along the Texas border were dispatching back, saying these guys are trying to put an end to this. Like, let's all calm down. The captured U.S. soldiers in Chihuahua were freed. Pershing's expedition would remain for months more, neither capturing Villa nor instigating a longer war. And in January of 1917, the Zimmermann telegram was made public, right, which was famously was from the German foreign minister, I think I'm getting this right, proposing to Carranza's government an alliance against the United States, in exchange for which Mexico would get back Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, and Colorado. Does this sound familiar, right? So I had always wondered why the Zimmermann telegram was taken seriously, because it seemed so crazy for the government of Mexico, which was still fighting for control of its own territory, to start a war with the vastly larger, more powerful northern neighbor. But I think the reason it was taken so seriously, again, by U.S. policymakers was that it invoked the specter of the Plan of San Diego and all the border chaos that they had already experienced. So the countries avoided war, but their shared border was never the same. U.S. National Guard units remained in place through the end of World War I in 1919. In 1917, Congress passed the most restrictive immigration legislation to date, which began to really police the border. And 8 years later, in 1925, the Border Patrol was created as a standalone agency, and the U.S.-Mexican border became yet more policed. And as with some of the other changes I've discussed, you could see this process on the line itself. So in 1932 here, this is a fence that we're looking at. It's still not super fortified by the standards of today, but for anybody who grew up in that place, this was a clear and dramatic change, right? You see the little guard post down there. Now this is the kind of familiar border that we're used to today. So I want to conclude on a kind of counterbeat or syncopation. My effort tonight has been to explain how we got the border that we're used to, a place of conflict and division. It's important to understand that the border continues to unite Mexico and the U.S. as much as it does divide them, and I believe that's true despite the politics and the rhetoric of the Trump administration, though I have a bad track record of predicting current events. I thought Obama could not be elected. I thought Trump could not be elected. So take my future prognostications for what they're worth. This slide is an image of the Los Ebanos, Texas ferry taken a few years ago by the Dallas photographer Jeffrey Gusky for our book Border Town, The Odyssey of an American Place. It's operated by people whose families have lived along the Rio Grande since before either the U.S. or Mexico existed. And to me, it suggests that the river is an invitation to cross, right? Is much more of a highway than it is to a barrier. Some people have demonstrated this in their own life. This is a picture of the emblem of LULAC, the oldest extant Mexican-American civil rights organization. This is a picture of its founding convention. In the aftermath of the Plan de San Diego, LULAC and the organizations that led up to it were founded by Mexican Americans in South Texas who had kind of been stuck in the middle of all this violence and found themselves appalled both by the effort to make a violent revolution and by the kind of vigilante violence. These were people who were proud of their Mexican heritage and culture, but also expected equal treatment as U.S. citizens. In other words, within themselves and within their own lives, they tried to reconcile the United States and Mexico and to be both Mexican and American. You can also see this in economic ties. In the century since the Mexican Revolution, the benefits of cross-border commerce have been reasserted by leading figures in both nations. My favorite example is from that crazy radical lunatic, Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater, one of the founders of modern conservatism. In 1962, on the 50th anniversary of Arizona's statehood, he looked 50 years hence to 2012 and confidently predicted that, quote, the Mexican border will become as the Canadian border, a free one with the formalities and red tape of ingress and egress cut to a minimum so that the residents of both countries can travel back and forth across the line as if it was not there. Well, he didn't exactly get that right about what Arizona and Sonora would look like in 2012, but nonetheless, this vision of trans-border commerce in some ways has been actually realized, and so this is a economist's measure of intense trucking nodes between Mexico and the United States. And one of the reasons I like this image is that it's actually hard to find the border, like right away. You have to stare and sort of retrace the border, right? It's like that old railroad network. And so we have seen then with NAFTA, the resumption of U.S.-Mexican trade cooperation. This is rising Mexican exports to the United States. There's similar questions of economic justice, as in the case of the Porfirian economic development on both sides, and people argue this has been bad actually for ordinary Americans and for ordinary Mexicans. And certainly that was highlighted in the Trump campaign, and I guess I don't particularly have a take on that and haven't presented the material to really get us into that. I'm just trying to suggest there are ways in which the United States and Mexico are still deeply plugged into one another. And then finally, you can see this just in the social life of people in the United States. And the fact is that about a third of Latin American descent people who are born in the United States marry outside their ethnic group, which is a mark of social integration and assimilation. I think it'll be a long, hard slog before we in the United States recognize our deep ties to Mexico, let alone when we honor them. But when we do, I think we'll have to see our border in a very different light, and the history of the U.S.-Mexican border will be one of the main ways that we understand the history of the modern United States. So thanks for your attention. I look forward to questions or comments. Nobody ever wants to ask the first question, except for a former history student.
What do you think of the ongoing dialogue, quote unquote, between our president and Vicente Fox?
The former president of Mexico, yeah.
Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I don't want to get into too many fights. So Fox has, since this is being taped, so I can't actually repeat some of the things that Vicente Fox has said to Donald Trump, but he's chided him. He's said the wall's a joke. There's no way we're going to pay for this. He's lambasted Trump. I mean, I think it's a sign, and Vicente Fox is, he was the first non-pre-president of Mexico since the first president not to come from the ruling party since it was solidified after the revolution. He's actually a Republican, basically, right? He's Mexico's equivalent to a Republican, so it's especially remarkable to have him doing the finger wagging at an American president. One traditionally would have expected that from more left-leaning political figures. And I think the other thing that's really interesting about Fox is that for decades, Mexican elites and the Mexican government look down on their own migrants to the United States and on Mexican Americans and characterize them in scathing terms that weren't so different than the way Donald Trump has, I think, scandalously talked about Mexicans and other Latin Americans. But Fox was the first Mexican president to honor them and actually called Mexican migrants heroes of Mexico, which is a really extraordinary statement when he made that. So I don't know if I have a take on that so much as just to suggest I think Fox captures a great deal of Mexican sentiment, which has come to embrace the Mexican part of the United States and to honor their connection with it and to reject being bullied by the United States. Yes, Professor Karamansky. Yeah.
You had a slide there after the crushing of the plan to San Diego.
Yeah.
And it said, no Spanish or Mexicans allowed. And so there's a distinction that's being made in that or is there? Did Texans think that some of the well-to-do landowning Mexican Americans who worked in civil offices and that, did they think of them as Spanish and not as Mexican?
Yes and no. I think what the sign actually reflects confusion more than anything else. And I think it's basically saying, whatever you call yourselves, we don't want you here, right? It's like, I think it's that. But I think the answer to your question is yes, right? So as discriminatory as Texas, and Texas wasn't particularly worse than much of the rest of the Southwest, became after the Mexican Revolution to its Mexican population, that kind of discrimination was never as systematic or as totalized as, say, the position of African Americans under Jim Crow. And there were a number of reasons for that. One of them was that the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, in essence, made Mexicans legally white. It declared that they were citizens if they remained in the United States. So discrimination against Mexicans was never as codified legally as the Jim Crow system. So even, in the 1930s, you had several dozen Mexican American students, say, attending the State University, UT Austin. When one black student tried to enroll, it was a constitutional crisis, and the National Guard had to be rolled out. So there is a real difference there that I think you're right to ask about that. So yeah, if you have property and money and were born in the United States, and especially if you can sort of pass as a white enough looking person, I think you could escape some of the worst things if you chose to. Yes, and then I also want to invite questions from students too. We like students, right? Yeah, but please go ahead, and students can think of something, and then we'll guilt them into it, okay?
You said that Mexican immigration into the U.S. really kicks off in the 19-teens.
Uh-huh.
What is it that's drawing that at that time, and why not earlier?
Sure, so there's a couple of things. I mean, first of all, there's what's pushing it, which is mass civil war for a decade, which is so many of these people we would now call refugees, right? They are fleeing for fear of their lives. And the United States is easy to get to, not just because it's next door, but because American capitalists have helpfully built railroads, which run right into the United States, and they're hungry for labor and they're happy to hire you. So the other part of this, the pull, is the same thing that takes such large percentages of Poland, Italy, and before that, Germany, Ireland. We know the story, a good chunk of people from South China, which is that there's huge demand for labor and much better return for labor and wages in the United States. So you have a kind of a kind of economic opportunity. I think we tend to periodize immigration in terms of policy and even think about our border with Mexico in terms of policy and what we should do. And policy can affect things, and it can certainly make it easier or more difficult, safer or more dangerous to move. But to my mind, if you look at the last now 120 years of migration from Mexico, the one time it reverses is in the 1930s. And there's a depression, right? So American capitalism, the engine of American and world capitalism, seizes up and stops. So that pull factor goes away, and Mexico is much more stable. So the push factor has gone away. And then the other time that it stops and evens out is in the Great Recession, right after the recent economic, 2008, 2000, that seems like a long time ago, but relatively recent. There was no policy change. Nobody passed a law. There was no new bureaucracy. What happened was a dramatic economic change. It was a lot harder to come to the United States and get work. Questions from students? There's always a brave student who will ask the first question. I knew there was. Thank you. Yes.
What do you think the Bracero's program would help with the relationship between the United States and Mexico at the time?
And do I think Bracero program now would help, or the historic Bracero program? Yeah, so the questions about the Bracero program, which is, I think I have my facts in order, was an agreement in effect between the Mexican and U.S. governments between 1942 and either 1964 or 1965, under which 5 million Mexican men were brought on a temporary basis to the United States and allowed to work legally and expected to return to Mexico. And there was pre-screening. There was pre-screening done in Mexico, and a lot of my students, a lot of my Mexican American students at Loyola, their fathers or grandfathers were Braceros, so they would date their own history, family's history in this country to that program. The original reason it was signed was that, this gets back to the cooperation theme, the Mexicans weren't real big on fascism, and with war looming, or having, the U.S. having entered World War II, their contribution to the war effort was the Bracero Program, right, as the U.S. was gearing its workforce up for wartime. Mexico could provide manual labor, and their other hope was that this would just be an input of labor, and that these people would actually come back to Mexico, which the Mexican government wanted them to do. And the hope was they would bring capital, but they would also bring modern work habits. There are really two problems with the Bracero Program, and I think most people who are immigrant rights activists today would recoil in horror at the thought that that would be the template for what we would do now. And the two problems, depending on your point of view, were these. The first one is that basically what the Bracero Program did was say to Mexico, we want your labor, but we don't want you. We don't want you as a citizen. We don't want you as a neighbor. We don't want you as part of our society. We want you to come back here and work for us at the bottom rung, and then get the hell out and go back. So most Mexican American civil rights groups and also organized labor really viewed it as an exploitative arrangement, as a kind of guest worker program that denied the humanity and the civil rights of the people that it was involved with. The other problem, as seen from the perspective of most governments, is that most Braceros figured this out pretty quickly, right? So if I come here and I'm a Bracero and I don't get along with my boss, and I'm fired, I have to go back to Mexico, right? And so my boss will tell me that. He will threaten me. He say, if you don't punch out and work for me for another hour, I'm firing you, which means that you're not free to go get another job. It means you no longer have the right to be in this country and you're subject to arrest. So they were basically like, screw this. I'm going to come to the United States, which I now know. And in fact, I now know a city like Chicago, and I now, I met a buddy in the bar who works at U.S. Steel who says he can get me a job. So I'm just going to walk across the border. I don't care if the U.S. government doesn't want me to. I don't care if my own government doesn't want me to. And I can be a much freer person and actually maybe get a better wage. So the idea of the Bracero Program was that it would bring in Mexican labor, but not have wider immigration and wider illegal immigration, and that just failed completely, and that's why it really falls apart in the 60s. So am I kind of speaking to your question? Yeah, there's a wonderful film called, oh God, I better not blank on the name now. It's called Sleep Dealer. You can stream it on Amazon. It's by Alex Rivera, and it is a kind of science fiction. Do you know this film? Are you serious? Oh yeah, it's thank you. I thought you were going to say it was terrible. I was really nervous there. But it's a science fiction version of the Bracero Program, where people get, it's like Blade Runner meets the border. People get these nodes, I think they're called, these implants, and instead of physically coming across the border, they work in the Maquila zone in northern Mexico, remotely operating robots, but it's still dangerous and exploitive. So it captures like the perfect idea that the Bracero is just a piece of abstracted labor who does not have to be recognized as a fellow human being.
Anyone else?
Maria
Yes.
Zakaria on Sunday morning
Uh-huh.
for the last few years has featured authors and personalities that, to me, what I'm hearing is argue against national borders and boundaries. Argue that essentially the movement of goods and people and ideas and new communities has transcended borders beyond what we could imagine, and that essentially there are the creation of new centers of peoples that make the old-fashioned nation state kind of a thing of the past. And even people that have talked about the wealthy and how the community of the wealthy jet set all over the world and have economic connections and political connections all over the world, kind of goes along with that. That for the wealthy too, their nation states and borders have less meaning today. I'm wondering if your study of the border would corroborate that, or what do you think?
I think that is an unfair question because it's so rich and so deep and so good. I do think that for the wealthiest people, the kind of cosmopolitan existence and mobility across borders that's possible in the modern world, right? You have a passport, you have money. I mean, you can get yourself pretty much anywhere on the planet, outside of North Korea, but North Korea is not going to become a, major tourist destination anytime soon. I do think they're trying to realize that borderless world, and certainly agreements like NAFTA or like GATT and the WTO or the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which has now been derailed perhaps for the best by the tenor of American politics, or an effort to kind of further implement or create that world, right? Especially for people with money. Especially for people in that world with money, the money to travel, the money to invest elsewhere. Perhaps surprisingly, given the stuff I've talked about, I'm a bit of a nationalist, actually. I actually like nation states, and I think one of the reasons is that they impose a kind of solidarity with one another in the sense that you owe your fellow citizens something, and you have some responsibility for their well-being, and that you can use your government to deal with social problems that the free market won't deal with. So think about things like Social Security, unemployment, healthcare. These are things that depend on a national state that collects taxes from its citizenry, and whose people feel a sense of solidarity with one another. So I guess to the extent I can find an actor in these kind of stories with whom I'm the most sympathetic, it's actually the Mexican-American civil rights people after the Plan of San Diego. And what they really fear is actually a version of what you're talking about. What they fear is statelessness. And they talk about this. They say, we're afraid that Mexicans in the US are going to become the Jews of the Western Hemisphere, right? These people who have to wander around making a home wherever they can, who are not recognized or treated with dignity by any government, right? Whether the Mexican government or the American government or the government of Texas. And what they wanted to do was to assert their right to be a part of the United States and to have the political guarantees of the United States, which, like a lot of Mexican liberals, like even Francisco Madero, they very much identified. So that may be a little bit of an abstract response to you, but I think I'm more of an old school sort of social democrat kind of New Deal person who believes in a government and social programs and a sense of social solidarity. And I hope that's what we get out of our current politics. We might get something much worse. But I think what a lot of people in this country are saying, including a lot of people who used to vote in the United States for the kind of New Deal politics, are that you guys who jet set around have lost sight of the fact that you have a country that has obligations to its citizens that it's not fulfilling.
Anyone else? Before you lose this opportunity.
Would you say that this whole thing is almost related to these days how Muslims are trying to come to the U.S., but there's been backlash against it, and just like in general, it seems like terrorism committed by people is making people think that the majority of Muslims are, essentially, terrorists. Not saying I think they are, but it just seems like that's what's happening these days. Like people are just assuming things of certain groups.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's a really astute observation. I mean, if this sort of thing continues, and especially with changing family patterns and economic development in Mexico and much of the rest of Latin America. I think, if I were to come here and give this talk in 30 or 40 years, I think the sort of archetypal problematic migrant or illegal alien will likely be a Muslim from the Middle East or from South Asia, and so that will have gone from Chinese as illegal aliens to Mexicans as illegal aliens to now Muslims as the supposed enemy whose supposed danger and criminality are greatly exaggerated. Although honestly, in the 19-teens and the 1920s, Italians, I think, would have come close to fitting that role in American policy, and that actually drove a lot of exclusionist legislation in the United States, and they were associated with anarchism and political radicalism and figures like Sacco and Vanzetti. So I think you're right to wonder that. My track record, again, for predicting the future is not so good. Yeah.
Just especially with, our president,
Mhm.
So.
Yeah, although he has it in for, I'm not going to be shy about saying, he obviously has it in for Mexicans. This guy has a pathological hatred of Mexicans, and it shocks me that somebody who expresses those kind of sentiments can hold the highest election in the office. So it's not just the Muslims that Donald Trump has it in for, but we'll see. Yes, maybe one last question, Eileen, is that okay? Yeah. Since you know what sleep dealer is, I have to call on you. Yes.
So you mentioned having not the best track record, so I'm going to ask, do you foresee at any point, you mentioned the genocide that happened, I believe with the postcards,
Mm-hmm.
comparing it to the lynching postcards, do you foresee any larger scale responsibility taking for what happened in that situation on America's part?
Wow, that's a tough one. You mean, do I see the United States sort of more fully reckoning with its anti-Mexican history?
In the early 1900s.
Yeah, in the early 1900s. I don't know. Things got farther in Texas than I would have thought, with a museum exhibit sponsored by the state-funded Museum of Texas History that named, it didn't just say mistakes were made, it named some of the people who did it. It identified them as Texas Rangers. It used the word murder rather than kill, right? So saying this is saying that this was a crime. And a representative from South Texas who is close to many of these families had actually introduced a bill calling for a formal state apology. There's no way something like that could pass the Texas House of Representatives today. I'm not worried about that. I'm not worried about that happening. But I guess, I don't know, but I do think that what people find is that they make a history that helps them understand the world that they live in. And the United States we live in is the United States that's well on its way to being a quarter Latino, right? And the vast majority of that is Mexican descent. And that actually works out pretty well, including in conservative places like Texas, which was actually one of the latest places to come to hardcore anti-immigrant politics, and major Republican figures like the Bushes avoided this kind of rhetoric, went out of their way to avoid this kind of rhetoric. So I don't know. It's not going to happen in the next few years. That seems pretty clear. So how's that for a lame non-answer to a difficult question? Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much. You've been a wonderful audience. I appreciate it. That's for good questions. I'm glad the students got it.
Well, thank you, Dr. Ben Johnson, and thank you to my colleagues in the History Department at Lewis for your support, and for all my history colleagues at Neighbor Settlement and Loyola and Joliet Irish American Association and Lewis students, and I especially were grateful to see all of you from Romeoville High School. We hope to see you seniors enrolled next fall in our history classes on campus.
Or at Loyola.
Or Loyola. Yeah. We'll go for that.
Is that allowed?
Yeah, I guess so. And you juniors, we hope to see you here next year. And before you go, you have to take some cookies and pop. So you're not allowed to leave until it's all gone. So thank you very much.
That was, yeah.